Welcome back to the Me First Method, Episode 2. Now, last week we talked about what self-abandonment is. Today let's talk about where it comes from. Because here's something I want you to remember throughout this entire series. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to abandon themselves. Nobody sits down as a child and says, you know what? I'm going to spend the next few decades ignoring my needs, suppressing my feelings, overextending myself, and making everyone else more important than me. It doesn't happen that way. Self-abandonment is usually learned slowly, quietly, gradually, one experience at a time, one message at a time, one adaptation at a time. And because it develops gradually, most people never realize it's happening. Think about a tree growing. You don't see it change from one day to the next. But 20 years later, it's completely different. Self-abandonment often develops the same way. Small experiences, repeated messages, tiny adjustments, until eventually those adjustments become your normal. Every child enters the world asking one fundamental question: what do I need to do to be loved? Not consciously, not with words, but through observation, through experience, through relationships. Children are constantly gathering information about how the world works. They learn what gets attention, what gets approval, what gets affection, what gets rejected, what gets criticized, what gets ignored. And because children depend on adults for survival, they become experts at adaptation. They learn very quickly what feels safe and what doesn't. When being yourself doesn't feel safe, imagine a child who expresses sadness and hears, "Stop crying." The child learns something, maybe not intentionally, but the lesson gets recorded. The lesson might become, sadness isn't welcome. Now imagine that same child expressing anger and hearing, "Don't talk back." Another lesson gets recorded, maybe, my anger isn't safe. Then imagine the child expressing a need. Maybe they need attention, comfort, support, reassurance, and they hear, "You're too sensitive," or "You're too needy," or "Stop being dramatic." Another lesson gets recorded, and eventually the child begins adapting. Instead of expressing sadness, they suppress it. Instead of expressing anger, they swallow it. Instead of expressing needs, they minimize them. Not because they're weak, not because they're broken, because they're smart. They're doing what humans do. They're adapting. Survival always makes sense. This is important. I don't want you leaving this lesson angry at your younger self. I want you leaving this lesson with compassion for your younger self. Because survival strategies always make sense in the environment where they were created. Let me say that again. Survival strategies always make sense in the environment where they were created. If you became a people pleaser, it probably helped you survive something. If you became hyper-independent, it probably protected you from disappointment. If you became the caretaker, it probably gave you a sense of control. If you became the peacekeeper, it probably reduced conflict. If you became the perfectionist, it probably helped you avoid criticism. These behaviors didn't come out of nowhere. They were solutions. The problem is that solutions can outlive the problems they were designed to solve. And when they do, they start creating new problems. Let's talk about some of the most common survival roles. As I describe these, pay attention to which one feels familiar. You may recognize one. You may recognize several. Most people do. The caretaker learns, my value comes from taking care of others. They become responsible for everyone. Everyone's emotions, everyone's needs, everyone's problems, everyone's happiness. The caretaker feels uncomfortable when other people are uncomfortable. They often feel guilty resting, guilty saying no, guilty putting themselves first, because deep down they learned, being needed equals being valuable. The challenge, eventually they become exhausted, and often secretly resentful, not because they're bad people, because they're carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. The fixer believes, if I can solve everyone's problems, everything will be okay. They constantly jump into rescue mode, offering advice, finding solutions, taking over, managing crises, carrying burdens, The fixer often struggles to simply sit with someone's pain, because helping feels safer than witnessing. The problem: you cannot fix other people's lives, and trying to will eventually drain you dry. The peacekeeper avoids conflict at all costs. They say yes when they mean no, agree when they disagree, stay silent when they want to speak. Not because they lack opinions, because conflict feels dangerous. Even minor disagreements can trigger anxiety. The peacekeeper often sacrifices authenticity for harmony. The problem is that peace purchased through self-betrayal is never real peace. Eventually it becomes resentment. The strong one learns, I can't fall apart because everyone depends on me. They become reliable, capable, independent, resilient. They rarely ask for help, rarely show vulnerability, rarely admit when they're struggling. Everyone sees them as strong, but very few people know how much they're carrying. The strong one often receives admiration, but rarely receives support, and after years of being everyone's rock, they become emotionally exhausted. The perfectionist learns, if I do everything perfectly, I can avoid criticism. They strive, push, perform, achieve, over-prepare, overthink, overwork. Perfectionism is often mistaken for ambition, but underneath it is usually fear. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of not being enough. The tragedy of perfectionism is that no achievement ever feels like enough. Because the real issue isn't performance, it's self-worth. Take a moment here, ask yourself, which role have I been playing? The caretaker, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the strong one, the perfectionist, maybe several. Most people don't fit neatly into one category. Many of us become combinations. A caretaker and a peacekeeper, a strong one and a perfectionist, a fixer and a caretaker. And here's what I want you to understand. These roles are not who you are. They're who you learn to become. There is a difference, a very important difference. Because if these roles were learned, they can also be unlearned. The real danger isn't developing the role. The real danger is forgetting it's a role. At some point you stop saying, I take care of people, and start saying, I am the caretaker. You stop saying, I help solve problems, and start saying, I am responsible for everyone. You stop saying, I try to keep the peace, and start saying, it's my job to keep everyone happy. That shift matters, because once a role becomes your identity, letting go of it feels terrifying. It feels like losing yourself. But what if you're not losing yourself? What if you're finally meeting yourself? What if beneath all those roles is someone who has been waiting years for your attention? Someone with needs, dreams, opinions, desires, boundaries, truths. Someone who deserves a place in their own life. Because that's what this journey is really about. Not becoming someone new, coming back to someone you've neglected. You. In the next episode, we're going to explore something that surprises almost everyone. We're going to talk about the hidden costs of self-abandonment. Not just emotionally, but physically, mentally, relationally, and energetically. Because many of the symptoms people struggle with every day are not signs that they're failing. They're signs that they've been carrying too much for too long, and it's time to understand exactly what that cost has been. Until next time, choose you.